The oak matrix anchor 18 serves as a practical interface for navigating reality, shifting from complex metaphysical theory to a set of portable operational keys that anyone can apply to their daily interactions. Joe Bandel frames this specific anchor as the bridge between the high-concept philosophy of his earlier work and the immediate, lived experience of what he calls the tank current or the living hum. It's essentially the user manual for maintaining coherence when dealing with people, ideas, or even artificial intelligence.
It's a fascinating shift in his work. If the earlier anchors in the oak matrix were about building the architecture of a unified field theory, blending physics, psychology, and Gnosticism, Anchor 18 is where he says, stop looking at the blueprint and start using the tools. He calls these operational keys diagnostic lenses. They aren't rules you have to memorize. They're more like patterns you look for to see if a system is healthy or if it's stuck in what he terms phase lock or resistance.
One of the most provocative aspects of this approach is the first practical key, treating blind spots as structural. Most of us view a blind spot as a personal failure or a lack of information, but Bandel argues that what remains unseen is actually shaping the field of interaction. He suggests a very specific practice of asking, what might both of us be missing? It moves the conversation away from being right or wrong and into a shared exploration of the background patterns.
That's a major departure from traditional debate. Usually we try to expose the other person's blind spot to win the argument. Bandel is saying that the blind spot is part of the system's design. By acknowledging it together, you prevent the exchange from closing down prematurely. It relates to his broader concept of duality as a loving embrace rather than a conflict. If you accept that your perception is always partial, you stop fighting the other person's perspective because you realize you need it to see the full picture.
That leads directly into the second key, which is the balance between grounded and symbolic language. I've noticed in his translations of German fantasy and his own metaphysical writings, he often oscillates between these two. In Anchor 18, he says these aren't rivals. Grounded language gives you precision, while symbolic language gives you depth. If you're stuck in a false debate, he suggests deliberately alternating, asking for the grounded version and then the symbolic layer until they both resonate.
It's like having binocular vision. If you only have the grounded, literal facts, the world feels flat and mechanical. If you only have symbols and metaphors, everything gets blurry and loses its edge. Integration happens when you can see how both layers point to the same truth. This is how he approaches his translations of authors like Hans-Heinz Ewers or Paul Busson. He's looking for that underlying resonance where the fantastic symbols meet the grounded human experience. It stops the intellect from getting trapped in literalism.
There's also this emphasis on patience in the third key, iterative thresholds. Bandel describes transformation not as a single lightning bolt moment, but as the convergence of many small interacting shifts. He uses terms like swelling, compression, and leap to describe the natural rhythm of progress. It feels very organic, almost agricultural, which fits the whole oak metaphor. You have to trust that around and around phase where it feels like nothing is happening, but the system is actually preparing for a reorganization.
He's very critical of the idea of forcing change. In his earlier work on what he called direct current or DC initiation, he talked about how rigid, hierarchical systems try to hammer things into place. Anchor 18 moves toward an alternating current or AC model. In an AC circuit, the energy flows back and forth. It's reciprocal. So these iterative thresholds are just the cycles of that energy building up until the container can't hold it anymore, and it has to leap to a new level of coherence.
Which brings us to the concept of calibrated microfeedback. This is one of the more technical-sounding keys. He describes it as a gentle spark, brief, precise corrections that land and release immediately. He compares it to touching an electric fence and grounding the shock. The goal is to bypass the ego's defense mechanisms. If you give a huge emotional critique, the other person shuts down. But if it's a low-emotion micro-correction tied to the immediate moment, they can self-adjust without feeling threatened.
It's efficient. It's about reducing friction. If you look at his background in electrical engineering analogies, he's basically talking about maintaining a clean signal. Over-explanation or repetition just adds noise to the system. By keeping feedback surgical and immediate, you allow the other person to remain sovereign in their own space. This leads to the fifth key, catalytic presence. This is the idea that just being a stable, non-imposing field allows others to reorganize at their own pace. You don't push, you just hold a coherent space.
That stable field can actually feel quite strange to people at first. Bandel mentions that it might feel weird or unfamiliar because we're so used to people trying to influence us or project their agendas. But over time, that catalytic presence feels safe. It's the womb is always open metaphor he uses in his Oak Tarot of love and romance. It's about providing a container where growth can happen naturally rather than through external pressure.
And it's a cycle. The sixth key is structure, saturation, and release. Every framework, including the Oak Matrix itself, eventually saturates. It does its job, and then it becomes a cage if you don't let it go. Bandel is very clear that Anchor 18 is about knowing when the scaffolding has served its purpose. You have to be willing to let the structures fall away so the direct embrace can be remembered. It prevents the system from becoming a rigid doctrine.
That seems to be the ultimate goal of the seventh key, coherence as the living hum. When everything is working, when you've accounted for blind spots, balanced the grounded and symbolic, and allowed for iterative growth, you get this felt stability. He calls it the tank current. It's a quiet, rhythmic vibration that signals genuine resonance. If there's friction or drag, it means there's a blind spot or a partial phase lock where someone is trying to control the outcome.
The tank current is a very specific technical term from electronics, referring to a circuit that oscillates at a specific frequency and stores energy. In Bandel's metaphysics, this is what happens when two people or systems align perfectly. It's not just a nice feeling. He describes it as a measurable physiological signature. When the hum appears, you trust it. You stop managing the interaction and just ride the wave. It's the difference between trying to play a song by thinking about every note versus just being the music.
It's interesting how he frames these as portable tools. You can use them for creative processes, inner work, or even navigating a difficult conversation at work. You don't need to believe in the full oak lattice or the organic Gnosticism behind it. You just have to be able to observe these patterns. It's a very pragmatic end to a very complex system. He's saying, here's the interface, now go live it.
And that lived experience is what he calls intense living. It's not about adrenaline or busyness. It's about the vibrancy that comes from being fully coherent. By using these keys to reduce internal and external friction, you become a coherent relational node. You aren't just surviving a hostile world, you're actively contributing to a network of resonance. It turns the act of simply being present into a form of spiritual bravery because it requires you to drop your agendas and trust the natural rhythm of the grove.
It really shifts the focus from acquisition, getting more knowledge or more power, to resonance. The idea that all that is needed is already here is central to Anchor 18. The keys aren't bringing something new into the room, they're just clearing the debris so we can see what was already happening. It's about returning to a fundamental state of flow where the surge and contain of life work together rather than against each other.
It's also a safeguard against the toxic brainwashing he mentions. Most systems want to lock you into a single perspective or a rigid hierarchy. By emphasizing blind spots, iterative thresholds, and the cycle of release, Anchor 18 keeps the individual sovereign. You're navigating the matrix, but you aren't being consumed by it. You're using the keys to stay fluid, which is the only way to survive in a world that's moving away from those old, direct current power structures.
It's a demanding vision, though. It requires a lot of self-honesty to ask what your own blind spots are, or to admit when a structure you've built has reached saturation and needs to be released. But the promise is that quiet hum, the feeling that you're finally in sync with the underlying physics of the soul, as he puts it. It's moving from the war on the shadow to making fragments into friends.
Exactly. Instead of trying to conquer your flaws or your enemies, you look for the reciprocal exchange. You see the resistance as the necessary other half of the movement, like the soil providing the resistance for the seed to grow. When you stop fighting the duality, the energy that was wasted in conflict is suddenly available for creation. That's the real operational power of the interface layer. It's about efficiency, coherence, and ultimately a more vibrant way of being human.
The operational keys of Anchor 18 offer a roadmap for moving beyond conflict and into a state of shared resonance, providing the tools to navigate the complex layers of our modern world with grace and clarity. If this exploration of the Oak Matrix resonated with you, consider sharing this episode with someone who might benefit from these practical tools for navigating life's complexity.